In the rolling hills of northern Delaware, where the Brandywine River carves its way through valleys shrouded in morning mist, stands a monument to American wealth and power. The locals called it many things over the years: the palace, the compound, the estate. But those who truly knew its secrets whispered another name in hushed tones after dark. They called it the Fortress. This is the story of Winterthur, the DuPont family stronghold that became both museum and mausoleum, a place where the pursuit of beauty concealed something far darker. It is a story of obsession, control, and the terrible price of perfection in a dynasty built on gunpowder and blood. The year was 1800, when Pierre Samuel DuPont de Nemours arrived in America with his two sons, fleeing the chaos of post-revolutionary France. They were nobility fallen on hard times, aristocrats without a country, seeking to rebuild their fortune in the new world. What they brought with them was knowledge, dangerous knowledge. The elder son, Winterthur Fortress, had studied under the great chemist Antoine Lavoisier before the French Revolution consumed everything, including Lavoisier himself, at the guillotine, in 1802. Along the banks of the Brandywine Creek, Winterthur Fortress established his powder mills. The location was perfect, isolated yet accessible, with water power to drive the machinery and natural barriers to contain the inevitable explosions. Because explosions there would be. The black powder they produced was violently unstable, a substance that could change state from solid to gas in milliseconds, releasing devastating force. Workers at the mills lived with death as their constant companion. DuPont understood something fundamental about American ambition. The young nation would need gunpowder for expansion, for conquest, for war, and the DuPonts would be there to supply it, growing wealthy beyond imagination as America pushed westward, leaving destruction in its wake. By the middle of the 19th century, the DuPont Company dominated American explosives manufacturing. They supplied both sides in conflicts, profited from every shot fired, every mine detonated, every bridge demolished. War became the family business, and business was very, very good. This story truly begins in 1839, with Jacques-Antoine Biedermann and his wife Evelina. Evelina was Winterthur Fortress's daughter, born into the powder dynasty. Jacques came from Swiss banking aristocracy, his family hailing from the canton town of Winterthur, a place of old fortifications and older money. When they built their estate on a hillside in northern Delaware, they named it after Jacques' homeland, Winterthur, a fortress name for what would become a fortress home. The original structure was modest by later standards, a 12-room Greek Revival manor overlooking 2,000 acres of Delaware countryside. But Evelina and Jacques had grander visions. They began transforming the land, planting gardens that seemed to bloom eternally, creating pathways that wound through forests where the light never quite penetrated properly. Servants whispered about strange occurrences, tools that went missing and reappeared in impossible places, sections of the grounds where the family never walked, rooms in the house that remained perpetually locked. Jacques died in 1865. Their son James inherited the estate, but he lasted only 2 years before selling it to his uncle, General Henry DuPont. The official story claimed James needed money for other ventures. The truth, known only to a few family members, was that James could no longer bear living there. He had begun to hear things in the walls, see shadows that moved against the light. His wife found him one morning in the library, staring at a portrait of his parents, tears streaming down his face. He would say only that Winterthur remembered too much. General Henry purchased the estate for his son, Senator Henry Algernon DuPont, who moved there with his wife Mary Pauline Foster in 1874. The senator was everything the family demanded: ruthless in business, calculating in politics, uncompromising in his pursuit of power. He expanded DuPont's reach, securing contracts for the Spanish-American War that made the family even wealthier. He also expanded Winterthur, adding a new facade and library wing, bringing the house to 30 rooms by 1902. It was in that library, surrounded by volumes on chemistry and warfare, that the senator began his private research. He had become obsessed with something he called perfection through preservation. The exact nature of his experiments remained hidden, but servants reported strange chemical smells emanating from the basement laboratories he had constructed. Deliveries arrived in the dead of night, crates marked with symbols that none could identify. The senator's own correspondence, later discovered, referenced specimens and trials and the necessity of absolute control. Then came Henry Francis DuPont, born in 1880 at Winterthur. He would be the one to transform the estate into what it would become. A shy, nervous child, Henry Francis found no comfort in the world beyond Winterthur's gates. His father sent him to Groton School, hoping to toughen him, but the experience only deepened young Henry's psychological wounds. His mother died when he was 22, leaving him entirely under his father's domination. For a decade after graduating from Harvard, Henry Francis accomplished virtually nothing. He simply existed at Winterthur, planting flowers and trees, creating beauty to mask the darkness he sensed but could not name. His father recognized that his only son would never succeed in business or politics. So the senator made Henry Francis master of Winterthur's farms and grounds. It was a role that suited the younger man perfectly. He studied horticulture obsessively, traveled Europe to examine the greatest gardens, and began creating at Winterthur something that transcended mere landscaping. He was building a living fortress, a place where every tree, every flower, every pathway served a purpose beyond aesthetics. When Henry Francis married Ruth Wales in 1916, she moved into Winterthur, expecting a normal married life. Instead, she found herself trapped in a world of rigid formality and unspoken rules. The senator dominated the household completely. Ruth was forced to serve as his hostess, enduring dinner parties where footmen in knee breeches moved like ghosts through candlelit rooms, where conversation followed prescribed patterns, where one wrong word could bring icy silence. She wrote to her family describing Winterthur as beautiful but suffocating, like being buried alive in silk. The senator died in 1926, and Henry Francis finally inherited full control. He had been preparing for this moment his entire life. Within 2 years, he began the most ambitious expansion Winterthur had ever seen. From 1928 to 1932, he personally designed additions that increased the house from 30 rooms to 175. But this was not the typical Gilded Age display of wealth. Henry Francis had a different purpose entirely. He had visited Electra Havemeyer Webb's Vermont home in 1923 and experienced what he later described as a revelation. Webb collected American antiques and decorative arts, displaying them in room settings that recreated specific historical periods. Henry Francis saw immediately how he could adapt this concept for his own ends. He would create at Winterthur not merely a collection, but a complete reconstruction of American history, frozen in amber, preserved forever, under his absolute control. The transformation that followed bordered on madness. Henry Francis bought entire houses scheduled for demolition, dismantling them piece by piece to salvage paneling, doorways, fireplaces, staircases. The famous Montmorency stair hall came from a Maryland estate. The Port Royal parlor, sometimes called the most beautiful room in America, was reconstructed from elements of General John Cadwallader's Philadelphia home. Room after room took shape, each one a perfect period installation, representing a specific time and place in American history. But perfection came at a terrible price. Workers on the project reported disturbing experiences. Rooms that seemed to resist being built, where measurements constantly came out wrong, where materials inexplicably failed. One carpenter claimed he heard voices speaking colonial-era English in a room he was paneling. Another saw a woman in 18th century dress standing in a doorway watching him work. When he blinked, she vanished. Henry Francis himself grew increasingly isolated and controlling. He supervised every detail personally, often working through the night, making notes in leather-bound journals that he kept locked in a safe. His wife Ruth and their 2 daughters lived as prisoners in the expanding mansion. Construction noise echoed constantly. Rooms opened and closed, seemingly at random. The family would sometimes go days without seeing Henry Francis, who prowled the house in darkness, examining his acquisitions, making minute adjustments that only he could perceive. Ruth once wrote to a friend describing a particularly disturbing evening. She had heard music playing from somewhere deep in the house, a colonial-era melody on what sounded like a harpsichord. Following the sound, she found Henry Francis, sitting alone in what he called the Chinese parlor, staring at a painting on the wall. The music had stopped, but he continued to sit there, motionless. When she spoke his name, he turned to her with eyes that seemed to look through rather than at her. He said only, "They're all here now. All the rooms are filled." Then he stood and walked away, leaving her shaken in the candlelit room. If you're enjoying this story of American dynasties and their dark secrets, please subscribe to our channel for more deep investigations into hidden history. By 1950, Winterthur had become a labyrinth of 175 rooms spread across 9 stories, each one a meticulous recreation of a specific period and place. Henry Francis had amassed more than 90,000 objects: furniture, paintings, ceramics, textiles, silver, glass. He knew the provenance of each piece, could recite their histories from memory, understood their significance in ways that made curators weep with envy. But somewhere in his pursuit of historical perfection, something fundamental had shifted in Henry Francis DuPont. He no longer collected antiques to preserve history. He collected them to possess time itself. In 1951, Henry Francis made the surprising announcement that Winterthur would open to the public as a museum. The family moved to a smaller residence on the property. On the surface, this seemed like philanthropic generosity. But those close to Henry Francis understood the truth. He had completed his life's work. He had created a fortress of time, a place where the past lived on under his control. Opening it as a museum meant it would be preserved exactly as he intended, maintained according to his specifications, forever. The early visitors to Winterthur Museum reported feelings of unease that they struggled to articulate. The rooms were undeniably beautiful, filled with treasures of incredible historical significance. Yet something felt wrong. The spaces seemed too perfect, too precisely arranged, as though they were stages waiting for actors who would never arrive. Some visitors reported feeling watched, though they could never identify the source. Others found themselves disoriented, unable to remember the path they had taken to arrive at a particular room. One early museum guide, speaking decades later on condition of anonymity, described her experiences. She worked at Winterthur for 3 years in the 1950s, leading tour groups through the period rooms. At first, everything seemed normal, if extraordinarily beautiful, but gradually she began to notice patterns. Certain rooms felt colder than others, regardless of the actual temperature. In some spaces, her voice would echo oddly, as though the room were much larger than it appeared. She saw objects moved slightly from their designated positions, though no one else had been in the rooms. Most disturbing were the portraits. The painted eyes seemed to follow visitors with uncanny intensity. She quit after an incident she would never fully explain. She had taken a group into what was called the Empire Parlor, explaining the significance of the American Empire period furniture. As she spoke, she became aware of a figure standing at the edge of the group, a man in 19th century clothing, listening intently. When she looked directly at him, he was gone. But she knew what she had seen. One of the visitors, an elderly woman, approached her afterward and whispered, "I saw him too. He comes to see what's been done with his things. Henry Francis continued to live on the Winterthur grounds until his death in 1969. In his final years, he grew increasingly frail but maintained absolute control over the museum. He made daily inspections, recording every minute detail in his journals. He personally trained the staff, demanding they follow procedures he had established down to the exact wording of descriptions. Any deviation was unacceptable. The house, he insisted, must remain exactly as he had created it, perfect, unchanging. Forever. When he died, he left Winterthur a $70 million endowment, one of the largest such gifts in American museum history. His will contained hundreds of pages of specifications detailing exactly how the museum should be maintained. Room temperatures must stay within precise ranges. Certain objects must never be moved. Specific cleaning procedures must be followed without deviation. His personal journals, more than 200 volumes, were sealed in the library with instructions that they remain closed for 50 years after his death. In the decades since, Winterthur has become one of America's most respected institutions for the study of decorative arts. Scholars come from around the world to examine its collections. The gardens attract hundreds of thousands of visitors annually. Graduate programs train new generations of curators and conservators. On the surface, everything appears exactly as Henry Francis intended. A triumph of preservation and public education. But there is another Winterthur that exists beneath this respectable facade. The night staff knows it. The security guards who patrol the darkened corridors have their stories. The conservators who work alone in the restoration laboratories understand that something lingers in those perfect rooms. Objects move. Not often, not obviously, but enough to be noticed by those who pay attention. A chair shifts slightly from its designated position. A portrait hangs at a different angle than it did the day before. Flowers in the arrangements seem fresher than they should be, as though someone had replaced them during the night. Temperature sensors occasionally record impossible readings, a room that drops 30 degrees in minutes, then returns to normal before any technician can investigate. The most disturbing reports come from the restoration workshops, where conservators work on damaged pieces from the collection. Multiple staff members have described the same experience. They'll be working on a piece of furniture, carefully removing centuries of accumulated grime, and they'll feel a presence behind them. Not threatening exactly, but intensely focused. Watching. Judging. When they turn around, nothing is there, but the feeling remains. One conservator, a 30-year veteran, described it as being examined by something that cares deeply about the work, that needs the piece to be restored perfectly, that will accept nothing less. The sealed journals became accessible in 2019, 50 years after Henry Francis's death. A small team of scholars was granted permission to examine them. Most of the content proved to be exactly what was expected. Meticulous notes on acquisitions, observations about objects, thoughts on display arrangements. But scattered throughout the later volumes were passages that suggested Henry Francis' relationship with Winterthur had evolved into something beyond normal collecting. He wrote about the rooms waking up as he completed them, about objects that seemed to recognize each other when he placed them in proper historical context. He described walking through Winterthur at night and hearing echoes of the lives that touched these things. In one disturbing entry from 1962, he wrote, "I understand now what Father was attempting. Not preservation of objects, but preservation of time itself. The past doesn't die here. It accumulates, layer upon layer, until the walls can barely contain it. Sometimes I think I'm not creating a museum. I'm building a trap for history, forcing it to stay when it wants desperately to move forward." The scholars who examined these journals were sworn to secrecy about certain passages, but rumors circulated. Henry Francis had written about his father's basement laboratory, about experiments that had nothing to do with explosives or chemistry, about the senator's theory that objects retain something of the people who owned them, that through proper arrangement and preservation, one could create spaces where the past exerted a physical force on the present. That Winterthur itself had become a kind of engine for this effect, growing more powerful as more historically significant objects were added to its collection. One passage, leaked anonymously to researchers, described Henry Francis's final visit to every room in the house just months before his death. He wrote, "I walked through them all tonight. Every single space. I could feel them, all the lives that touched these objects over centuries. They're bound here now, held by the perfection of the settings, unable to move on. Have I created something beautiful, or have I built a prison? I no longer know. What I do know is that I cannot leave. Even after death I will remain. Someone must maintain the order, must keep everything exactly as it should be. The walls remember. The rooms remember. And now, I fear, I will remember forever." When the current director of Winterthur was asked about these passages, she smiled politely and dismissed them as the rambling thoughts of an elderly man in declining health. The museum's official position is that Henry Francis DuPont was a visionary collector and a meticulous preserver of American history. His legacy is the incredible gift he gave to the nation, a window into the decorative arts and daily lives of Americans over 2 centuries. Nothing more, nothing less. But ask anyone who has spent significant time alone at Winterthur after dark, and you might hear different stories about the guide who quit after repeatedly finding period-appropriate flowers fresh in vases each morning, though no florist had been scheduled. About the security system that shows doors opening and closing in empty sections of the house. About the temperature fluctuations that defy physical explanation. About the overwhelming sense, particularly in the most historically perfect rooms, of being in a place where time doesn't quite function normally. There's a reason Winterthur maintains such strict climate and lighting controls, far beyond what normal preservation would require. A reason why certain rooms are never shown on public tours. A reason why the museum employs an unusually large security staff for a decorative arts institution. The official explanations always sound reasonable: protection of valuable objects, insurance requirements, safety protocols. But long-time staff members know the truth. They're not just protecting the collection, they're containing something. The DuPont family built their fortune on gunpowder, on substances that exist in a volatile state between stability and explosive transformation. Perhaps it's fitting that their greatest architectural achievement became a different kind of unstable compound. Winterthur stands as a monument to American taste and history, but it's also a warning about the dangers of trying to preserve the past too perfectly, to control time itself through sheer force of will and unlimited resources. Henry Francis DuPont achieved what he set out to do. He created period rooms so authentic, so perfectly realized, that stepping into them really does feel like traveling through time. But in achieving that perfection, he may have created something that transcends normal museum space. A place where the boundaries between past and present have grown dangerously thin, where objects don't just represent history, but somehow embody it, where the pursuit of preservation has led to something that can never truly be released. The fortress still stands. Its 175 rooms filled with treasures, its gardens blooming in carefully orchestrated succession throughout the seasons. Visitors walk through its spaces, marveling at the beauty and historical significance. Most leave feeling they've experienced something special, a unique window into American history. But some leave disturbed, unable to articulate exactly why they felt uneasy in those perfect rooms. Late at night, when the last visitors have departed and the lights are dimmed, Winterthur transforms. The staff who remain speak of it in hushed tones, how the house seems to breathe differently after dark, how shadows fall in patterns that seem deliberate rather than random, how footsteps echo from empty corridors, how, sometimes just for a moment, you might glimpse a figure in period dress, standing in a doorway or sitting in a chair, examining their surroundings with an expression of profound recognition before fading away, and somewhere in all of it, perhaps Henry Francis DuPont remains as well, making his eternal rounds, checking that every object sits in its proper place, that every room maintains its perfect historical accuracy. Still controlling, still preserving, still trapped by his own obsession with perfection, the fortress keeps its secrets. The walls remember, and in the darkness between closing time and dawn, when Winterthur belongs entirely to itself, the past grows stronger, pressing against the present, held in check only by the elaborate systems of control that Henry Francis established. It's a beautiful place, a place of incredible historical significance, but it's also a place where the normal rules have been bent, where preservation has become something more than academic exercise. This is the legacy of Winterthur. Not just a museum, not just a collection, but a fortress built from time itself, where the pursuit of perfection created something that may never be fully understood, where an American dynasty's wealth and obsession combine to produce an institution that serves both as tribute to our history and as warning about the price of trying to hold on to the past too tightly. If you found this investigation into one of America's most mysterious estates fascinating, please like and subscribe. The darkness behind beautiful things deserves to be examined, and we'll continue bringing you stories that reveal what lies beneath the polished surfaces of American history. The fortress stands. The rooms wait, and somewhere in those perfect spaces, something that was never meant to be trapped continues to press against the walls, seeking release that may never come. This is Winterthur. This is the DuPont legacy. This is what happens when perfection becomes its own kind of prison.